Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Appreciate you joining us for our episode today. Actually, this is going to be part one of a two-part episode. We'll roll into the episode proper here in just a few minutes as we have once again guest host Brant Frost joining us. You may remember Brant back from his participation on our episode entitled Let the Wilkie Win, where we explored an alternative to the 1940 U.S. historical presidential election. Today I've asked Brent to join us for another topic that's related to American electoral history. This happens to be focusing on the election of 1800. So without any further ado, here's part one of the conversation that I had with Brent. Hope you enjoy it. Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. I'm Don Shelley, sitting in the host seat today. Happy to be joined once again by a co-host who actually participated in an episode not that far back. That would be one Brant Frost. Brant, I know that folks enjoyed your appearance on the podcast. I guess that was back in November or so of 2019. And so I wanted to have you back because just like me, you share a passion for American history, but also American political history, electoral history. And particularly here during the month of January, we're going to do a couple of episodes that are separate but are sort of tied together. Of course, Alexander Hamilton has become popular in our society again, primarily because of the Tony Award-winning musical that has achieved much acclaim since its premiere and debut in 2015. The musical is called Hamilton, but there's another very powerful character inside of that musical, and that's Aaron Burr. And so today we're going to be looking at some what-if history that relates to Aaron Burr. And we're doing it here in the month of January because January happens to be the month of Alexander Hamilton's birth. So we're going to have a couple of episodes this month that sort of center around Hamilton-related things. And so the first of those is actually going to be a discussion here where Brant and I are going to look at least one possible timeline or historical scenario that could have happened that relates to the election of 1800, and that's going to center around Aaron Burr. And so, Brant, let me wish you a happy 2020, and let you introduce yourself again to the audience briefly, and then we'll get rolling on stuff.
Well, thank you very much, and it's always great to be with you, and I appreciate the great work that you've done putting this together. It's always great to listen to a podcast where you obviously have a host who's so enthused about the topic, and just starting from the bottom and working your way up. It's a wonderful thing about the podcasting business is that it gives people the tools to basically do what in previous generations you would need a radio station and thousands of hours of expert training and a lot of money to start. Now we can do this and listen to it and basically form a discussion group with people all over the world for free. It's really amazing.
It is sort of cool. When I first chasing this a little bit, I think it's important. You know, people that are listening to the podcast probably already know this. So but I'm amazed always when I talk to coworkers and colleagues and people that I meet. There's a number of people that are very familiar with the medium, just as you've described it. There are others that are still just coming to it. But that's what amazed me when I first came around to the medium, I guess about 6 or 7 years ago, was just realizing that suddenly there's this diversity out there and unique communities can find each other in a way that wouldn't make commercial sense, as you just described, on a radio show. But, you can have 300 to 400 or 500 people around the world who enjoy something that becomes viable. And again, the cost to be able to do it and the technology to be able to do it is there. So I think it is cool. It just as the internet has revolutionized in good ways and bad ways, the way that we exchange information and how we connect with each other. This is a medium that didn't exist before and allows platforms that didn't exist before. So I'm excited about it. And as those that are regular listeners to the podcast know, my daughter and I both love doing this. It's something we can share, which is another cool thing about that. So, again, you and I have developed a relationship here now because you found us. it's unlikely we would have necessarily ever run into each other and discovered that we had this common interest without the podcast. So that's just one example of what's happening there. So let me set the stage for folks who may not know a lot about Aaron Burr. I was looking for, can you sum him up in one quote? And he's such a complex man. I think that's a very difficult thing to do. But one of the quotes that I kept coming back to, which was reported to be one that he said, is that law is whatever is boldly asserted and plausibly maintained. And I think as we go through and uncover a little bit about Burr's character here and his personality, and he is a forceful personality. Whether you love him or hate him, you can't deny that he is a forceful personality. I think that quote is sort of a highbrow type of quote, but I think it embodies a lot of the way that he thought. If you're bold enough to do something and you support it, it might as well be law. Would you agree with that, Brant?
Well, it I think is one of those quotes that could have a double meaning. He was a lawyer and tried many cases, right. And in the context of the courtroom, it is very much true, particularly in those early days of our nation, that law can be whatever you boldly assert and maintain. If you're working a jury in New York City, as he would have been in the early days of the Republic, and you assert something and assert it with confidence and keep at it, you've got a good chance of getting them to believe it. And I think as a lawyer, that kind of might be sort of a joke among fellow lawyers. Now, I think that he also understood that from the nation building perspective too, that if you have the guts and the courage to do something and make it stick, most people will go along with you as well. However, that might have been, but for those folks who that kind of bold assertion of real politique would have been too much for them, he would have just said, "Oh, I'm talking about a court of law." You know,
right.
It's like so many things. If it can have multiple meanings depending on how you assert it. And right. when he probably told it or wrote it originally, his reader was thinking about a courtroom, but I think he, at least to some extent, was thinking about nation building as well. Because remember, he was a witness to the American Revolution and the War of Independence that followed it. So he understood how force and will, coupled with justification, can be used to create, almost anything.
Yeah, and one of the things we won't have time today to go into or delve. I'll include a couple of links in the show notes. One of them will be just to the Wikipedia article, for example, on Burr. So someone can, if they're not familiar with his biography, the real world biography, the historical what did, you have a chance to go through that. But yes, he has quite a career as a soldier, as a politician, as a lawyer. Without even looking at this historical what if that we're going to look at today, he's a fascinating character. He's I was watching actually a brief documentary last night on him preparing for our podcast today. And, in the last 15 to 20 years, there's been sort of a resurgence, not just because of, him appearing in a popular Broadway musical as a character, but in trying to understand who he was. And he's looked at a little bit differently now by historians, modern historians, than by historians that came before. One of the interesting things about Burr to me, and we'll see this here, is he was not afraid. You and I had this conversation off podcast. I guess it was yesterday, Brent. He was not afraid to do things today that we would look at and go, well, that's what politicians do. But back during the age that he's living in, it was a different age, and that was considered bold, scandalous. I don't know exactly what word to assign to it, but for example, he had the audacity in an election to campaign door to door. I mean, and that was scandalous.
Indeed. Well, Thomas Jefferson would almost certainly have never become president if not for Aaron Burr, because in 1800, Aaron Burr organized an effort to take control of the New York state delegation to the Electoral College. New York was the key swing state in that election, and Burr came up with a plan to win that state. And what he did was, in those days, you had to win control of the state legislature, because the state legislature decided who would be the electors in the Electoral College for that state. So Burr went around and organized a campaign operation, put together a door-to-door grassroots campaign, raised the money, and assembled a slate of candidates. Particularly, what he discovered was that in the upstate regions of the state, it was pretty much set in stone. Most of the upstate counties would go for the Republican candidate for legislature. A few would go Federalist, but the city of New York was the key. So it made sense to organize a door-to-door operation because in the city, and of course, New York wasn't a city back then. People generically referred to New York, but officially you had Manhattan, which was a growing but still relatively small area. You had areas like the Bronx and so on, but that was still the key swing area. So he organized a slate of candidates to run in New York City, or what would become New York City, including people like the former governor, George Clinton, who had been governor many times, run for vice president in 1792. And Clinton was an old man at this point and was reluctant to step forward. I mean, he'd served in the highest office in the state, and now Burr wants him to run for a lowly state legislative position. I mean, imagine if a former governor of your state, if you live in the United States, running for state representative after he's been governor. I mean, it's almost never heard of. But Burr knew that he needed a list of well-known names so that his guys could go around saying, "Did you know that the Federalists are secret monarchists?" "Well, I didn't know that." "Well, absolutely. And you don't want monarchy in America?" "Well, no, sir, I don't." "Well, here, take this list. Look at this list of patriots that are running for legislature. Look at Governor Clinton," and so on and so on and so forth. And you want men like that in office, don't you? "Well, yes, sir." "Well, you go on and do your duty." And so they just did this again and again and again, and they won the election because of superior organizing. Because of that, Jefferson was elected president and Burr was elected vice president. And without that effort, Burr and Jefferson would never have won, and Thomas Jefferson would never be president, let alone Mount Rushmore and all the other things that came after him. Right. So Aaron Burr is, and I think that Aaron Burr is underappreciated because he had the bad fortune to lose.
History remembers winners, right?
Well, Thomas Jefferson, during when there was the Burr trial and in the early 1800s, after Burr was vice president and had left office, during the trial for treason, there was no real evidence against Burr, but Jefferson obsessively was trying to find evidence. Some historians have speculated that Jefferson was temporarily deranged, had some mental imbalance that was affecting him for a couple of months, and then he snapped out of it or whatever, because it was very much a character for him to just obsessively chase after someone to try to get them ruined, to the point of trying to twist arms of witnesses, change venues, potentially bribe witnesses. I mean, these are things that were out of character with Jefferson's, the other parts of Jefferson's life. But he seemed to be obsessed with taking down Burr. And the funny part of it was that all the best evidence we have about what Burr wanted to do in the early 1805 was basically do a proto-filibuster expedition. Now, most people hear filibuster and think United States Senate today, but filibustering was a term that became popular in the 1850s when Americans would go to Central America and try to overthrow their corrupt governments and establish a new government, and eventually bring that country into the United States. They were not successful in ultimately bringing them into the United States, but several filibustering expeditions did successfully overthrow governments. Perhaps the most famous filibustering expedition, although a slow one, was the conquest of Texas. Stephen Austin probably didn't initially think about it as a filibustering expedition, but by becoming a consigliere, basically, for the Mexican government and a recruiter of settlers in Texas, he eventually brought in enough Anglo-Protestant settlers to where, when the time came and the central government of Mexico under Santa Anna tried to crack down on the rights of the territories in the states, they were able to successfully pull off a filibustering expedition from the inside. Rather than invade Texas from the outside, they were already in country,
right.
ready to spring forth. And I'm going to assume that our readers have, our listeners have enough of a basic knowledge of Hamilton and of Burr and Jefferson to where we could start with our point of divergence. And the best points of divergence, in my opinion, are the simplest, sort of an Occam's razor approach. So, we know that Jefferson ran for president in 1796. Burr was his vice president. They lost, and because of a fluke in the Electoral College, Jefferson became vice president, served 4 unhappy years with John Adams, and now there's the election of 1800, and now Burr, who's been a senator, attorney general of New York, and the main organizer of the effort in New York, successfully winning that state, is running for vice president with Jefferson on the Republican ticket. This is the original Republican Party, which, by the way, the modern-day Republican Party would take its name from, even though the modern-day Republican Party, when it was formed, had more in keeping with the Federalist and Whig tradition. They took the name Republican because of how much respected Jefferson was by the 1850s. Right. So, but this is what historians simply call the Democratic Republican Party, but they refer to themselves as Republicans. So,
and
it's Republican,
also,
I'm sorry.
It's also important to note that one of the things that, of course, Washington in his farewell address was well known for calling out was the hope and the desire that we would not move into a political system that was organized around parties. That was going to be inevitable. You're going to have elections. You're going to have parties. That's the way it's going to work. But certainly it doesn't take but these 2 election cycles to quickly see that there is now very much a 2-party arrangement that's going on that's contesting for offices, as you pointed out, both at the local and state level and certainly contesting at the national level. So in my mind, I think of the elections of even that election in 1796 when Adams succeeds and only holds the office for 1 term, Washington. You do have the scenario that by the time of the election of 1800, it's very clear that we have parties. And I think that's just an important thing to point out. I agree that most of our listeners probably are savvy and are historically aware enough to know that. But if you're not, it didn't take long for the country to develop into a point where now it wasn't just about individuals running for office, but the collective parties that were also contesting because they had different ideas about where to take the country.
Exactly. And so our point of divergence will be in this story is one of the electors who was supposed to vote for Jefferson and Burr ends up voting for Burr and someone else. In those days, there was no way of distinguishing who you wanted to be president or vice president. The Electoral College worked on the principle that the first place vote getter would become president and the runner-up would become vice president. So each elector would write 2 names on their ballot, but there was no way to distinguish who was supposed to be their candidate for vice president and president. Now, of course, the nomination process ensured that people knew who the nominee for president was supposed to be. But something happened in 1800 whereby Jefferson and Burr, there wasn't a plan to decide who was going to basically spoil their ballot or split their ballot so that Jefferson would be the nominee. I guess somebody was supposed to do it, but when you get to that point, 73 electors are turning in their ballots, 73 for Jefferson, 73 for Burr, which would send it to the House of Representatives. But at least for history and for what would be, for American, what will become the full United States, one of these electors switches Burr and somebody else. Perhaps a New York elector angry that in 1796 Jefferson's people in Virginia had double-crossed Burr and not given their electoral votes to him for vice president. Perhaps it was a South Carolina elector who who was a Federalist, who was elected in a compromise. South Carolina was very close in the debates, much like New York. There was a lot of debate in the legislature about who would be an elector. Perhaps one of the electors who was elected voted for Pinckney for one vote and Burr for the other. Not being a Jefferson fan, perhaps that's what happened, is a split decision. But at any rate, when the votes were counted in Congress, Burr had 73 votes and Jefferson had 72. There was no appeal, no change. That's that. and they're both elected. But Jefferson, who was supposed to be president, now finds himself as vice president. And of course, Burr realizes what a serious problem this is because he has no mandate to be president. So Burr offers Jefferson a deal. He will resign immediately upon taking office, and Burr will step aside, and Jefferson becomes president in exchange for Jefferson appointing him his Secretary of State, giving him control over federal patronage in New England, Pennsylvania, and New York State, and for making a public commitment to only serve one term and to agreeing to back Burr in 1804 for president. Jefferson, whose ambition has been concealed by history but was in fact a very ambitious man, considered this, but ultimately declined, many historians believe, because he was quite loyal to James Madison, and he wanted Madison to become president as soon as possible. And he thought that by making this deal, he was selling out James Madison's political future. So he held back and decided not to do it. But he also knew that Burr's legitimacy as president was dependent on him. If he turned against Burr and called him a usurper, this could ruin Burr's presidency. So he also had some leverage. So they ultimately made an agreement that Madison would be included in the cabinet, although not as Secretary of State, and that Burr would serve one term as president in exchange for the support of Jefferson and his many allies in Congress. After all, the Republican majority in the House of Representatives was dominated by Southerners. A Southerner was Speaker. Southerner was chairman of the vital Ways and Means Committee. So it was vital to have the South on board. So Burr basically agreed from the beginning to only be a one-term president, which means he also has to be a man in a hurry. He's only 45 years old, but he has to do whatever he wants to do in one term. So the first steps is he assembles his cabinet, and he starts out by appointing Robert Livingston, who had been minister, who Jefferson had thought to name minister to France and suggested to be named minister to France, but instead Burr names James Monroe as minister to France and appoints Robert Livingston, who was Chancellor of New York, as Secretary of State. He appoints Albert Gallatin, who's the Republican chief spokesman on financial issues in the Congress, to be Secretary of the Treasury. He appoints Henry Dearborn, a hero of the Revolution, to be Secretary of War. Robert Smith of Maryland to be Attorney General. He's a distinguished lawyer. And almost as a slight, he appoints James Madison to be Secretary of the Navy. Now, Madison had no real history with the Navy, but Burr wanted to keep the Navy strong, and he knew that the Republicans wanted to cut the Navy. So by putting Madison there, he put him in an impossible position whereby the number two Republican in the country after Jefferson would have to defend the Federalist Navy program that was established under the Adams administration. And we're still not sure why Madison agreed to be put in such a position. Jefferson wrote him letters encouraging him not to take the position, but I think that ambition played a role in there, and I think Madison preferred to be inside the tent rather than be outside the tent. There's a famous expression: it's better to have people inside the tent doing a certain thing outward than being outside the tent doing a certain thing inward.
Right.
That was the main difference in the styles of leadership. Burr wanted to expand the nation. He, like his rival Alexander Hamilton, believed that America should eventually encompass as much of the Western Hemisphere as possible, not just North America, not just Canada, but Mexico, Central America, and eventually perhaps South America, or as much of it as they could take. So he wanted a strong Navy and a strong Army. So Albert Gallatin was just pulling his hair out because Gallatin wanted to pay off the federal debt as soon as possible and cut taxes. But he and Burr were at loggerheads for several years about that, because Burr was okay with him cutting spending in other areas, but he did not want to eviscerate the Navy or the Army, because he knew what he needed them for in the coming years. So he didn't get as big an army as he wanted or as strong a Navy, but it was much stronger than it otherwise would have been had Gallatin had his way. And if Jefferson had been president, they definitely would have eviscerated the armed forces.
And just to make it clear, Brant, for our listeners, we're actually already headed down the alternate timeline here, and so
exactly.
Yeah,
Feel free to
because everything you're talking about there with
me.
President Burr never was president, and so I just want to point out very quickly, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but let's get back to it as well. What Brant has done for this episode, which I brilliantly love, and I have the benefit of it having it in front of me written out, is essentially he has the outline here for what I think will make a really good book someday if he ever gets the time to write it. And so we could explore a number of different Burr alternative timelines. I can imagine coming back to this topic again on the podcast because there's not just one possible what if when it comes to Aaron Burr. But we're going to explore, just so our listeners are clear today, we're going to explore one particular timeline that I think is well thought out, well rationed. So if you want to think of this as Brant giving you a preview of the book you're going to be able to buy at some point, that may be a healthy thing for you to be able to do. Is that a fair thing to say, Brant?
Yes, indeed. And feel free to interrupt me if you think that we're straying too far from what actually happened and that we need clarification. I like, I'm a big fan of Newt Gingrich's and William R. Fortune's trilogy on the Civil War, the Gettysburg and the Grant Comes East and The Last Man Standing. And when you read those books, they are so well written and so plausible that you could give them to someone who doesn't know much about American history.
And they would think they were reading the history, right?
Precisely. So I prefer not to pause through our narrative constantly saying, oh, by the way, this is what really happened, and so on.
Right.
People know this is a fork in time. They know that it's alternate history, and most of our listeners will be fairly familiar with most of what generally happened in this period. So I will, and if it strays significantly from what actually happened, we'll stop and tell them. But so you getting back to the flow of time, you still have a desire on America's part and President Burr to gain Florida and as much territory for the U.S. as possible. Now, when Napoleon offers Ambassador Monroe this deal of a lifetime to acquire not just Florida, but all of Louisiana, he, realizing the opportunity, jumps on it, and the United States acquires that incredible piece of real estate for fire sale prices.
And again, that's because Napoleon is engaged in. I mean, what's going on in Europe at this time? He needs money.
Napoleon needs money because he's engaged in a life and death struggle with the British, and the British Navy is trying to blockade him. William Pitt is trying to use British money to recruit allies, and this will play a key part in the subsequent American War with Spain, the Spanish-American War from 1805 to 1807, and where America will become a de facto ally of the British and the war of the Third Coalition, which will include the Young Campaign and the Battle of also the Battle of Trafalgar. Two of the most famous battles in history will be occurring during the same period when America is fighting its war as a sort of co-belligerent, though not ally officially, of the British, while they're fighting their war against France. And Spain, of course, is an ally, a satellite of Spain. France has Spain as an ally and satellite during this period. So by going to war with Spain, the United States will become de facto an ally of Britain. But that we're getting ahead of ourselves, of course. Another thing that happens during the Burr presidency is that almost immediately a constitutional amendment is introduced to deal with the issue of his accidental presidency. His opponents call him his accidency because he was elected by an accident. Now, his opponents and many in the Jefferson side of the Republican Party think that Burr orchestrated that. So they don't think it's an accident. They think it's because he conspired to make himself president. But notwithstanding that, what would become the 12th Amendment, which clearly lays out that an elector will cast one vote for president, one vote for vice president, is passed by Congress in 1801 and will be ratified in time for the 1804 election. And so you have a very similar situation to what we know to what happened in real life. But now by 1804, things really start to diverge because Burr declines to run for re-election as he had agreed. However, he sees Louisiana as just the stepping stone to something greater for America and for him. So he gets a commitment from Vice President Jefferson that in exchange for not pushing Secretary of State Livingston for president instead of Jefferson, that he will agree to sit back and let Jefferson be the nominee and take the leadership of the party and the election in exchange for being appointed a major general in the Army, the senior general in the Army, and being made governor of Louisiana. And Jefferson agrees. And as a result, Jefferson is nominated by the Republican caucus for president, and he defeats Livingston, and Livingston is nominated for vice president. And they go on to win by a comfortable margin over the Federalist ticket of Charles Cosworth Pinckney and Rufus King. But here's the key part. President Burr dispatches an expedition, which is led by Captain William Clark and Meriwether Lewis, who had been secretary to Vice President Jefferson and eventually would also be secretary to President Burr. And Burr gives Clark very clear instructions that if he ever, during this expedition, that it's a much stronger expedition than what Jefferson wanted to do. If Jefferson had his way, they would have sent out a very small expedition, mainly just to chart rivers, find the Pacific coast, to bring back some flora and fauna samples, write about the Indians. But Burr, who saw a war with Spain as in the very near future, wanted to get an expedition, a strong expedition, on the Pacific coast as soon as possible to build a fort and to seize as much territory as possible, because Spain had ambitions, pretensions to the Oregon territory. They were disputing it with the British. And Burr wanted Oregon. He also wanted California. So he sent Lewis and Clark with a much stronger expedition and told Clark that that his standing orders were to seize Oregon and eventually move down and seize the port of San Francisco. And then if at all possible, that was his expedition, to seize as much Spanish territory as possible. And he was to do that unless he heard regularly from Burr that the time was not yet right. But silence meant the war had begun and he needed to immediately put his plan into operation. Now, when Burr began that, during the same time, of course, Burr is preparing to leave office. And when he leaves office and goes immediately to Louisiana and to New Orleans to become the new governor, he is planning his own expedition along the Sabine River. You got to remember that in 1805 there was a serious dispute along the neutral zone, along what is now the border of Louisiana and Texas, between the United States and Spain, and there was this sort of no man's land. Well, Burr wanted to provoke the Spaniards into attacking an American military force in the neutral zone and giving them a cause to go to war with Spain so that he could grab Texas and perhaps all of Mexico. Because you got to remember, Burr is the consummate political and military planner. He has been in contact with the Catholic Church in Mexico and what was then called the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which stretched all the way from California down to Panama. And they do not like the current government because the Spanish Viceroyalty is trying to weaken the church and take away some of its property. So he makes a deal with the Catholic Church to support them in all their privileges in exchange for their support in driving out the Spanish. And they made that deal with him. And so he is ready. He knows that when he invades Mexico, and he will have many allies ready to join him, because the Catholic Church, the priests, have enormous influence over the laity and the common folk. And so he's laying the groundwork. And then fate drops a perfect opportunity in his lap when he discovers that the general who's his subordinate, General Wilkinson, has been taking money from the Spanish government to report on the actions of the American military and the American government. He's a spy, out and out spy domestic spy, the Alger Hiss of his day in the pay
Right.
of Spain. But rather than relieve him of his command just yet, Burr figures he can be useful. He offers Wilkinson a deal in exchange for a signed confession, which Burr will hold over his head, and his eventual resignation from the army within the year, and never seeking, basically disappearing from public life. He offers him that, and Wilkinson readily accepts, in exchange for Wilkinson feeding false information to the Spanish. And as a result, Burr tricks the Spanish into attacking an American force in the neutral zone. And that gives him the cause, the justification to begin his expedition into Texas. By the time that the word, and it takes a long time, many weeks, for word to get to Washington about Jefferson is in a bind. Americans have been attacked. Governor Burr, former President Burr, General Burr, is already leading an expedition into Texas. And what's he going to do? He doesn't want a war with Spain, but American public opinion is demanding it. The expansionists in the territory. So Jefferson is forced into asking Congress for a declaration of war on September 11th, 1805. And now the war has begun. And by going to war, the United States finds itself de facto ally with Britain, Austria, and Russia in what is already happening in Europe, which is the War of the Third Coalition against Napoleon and his ally, which is Spain. But here's the fun part. The Federalist Party, which had been opposing the Republican program up to this point, becomes enthusiastic supporters of this war, because Alexander Hamilton, who is still very much alive and with great power, has always wanted to see Mexico and South America annexed to the United States. So he supports this expedition, even though he and Burr are personally great political rivals, if not out and out enemies.
Right.
But he supports this war. He, in fact, as part of the effort to bring the whole country together, is given a military command, a major generalcy in the Army, as is Light Horse Harry Lee, who's a hero of the American Revolution, who, although he's over the age of 50 now, is still an eminent Virginia Federalist and has fallen on hard times. But this will help to rehabilitate his image. And historians have speculated that had it not been for the advantageous happening of this war, the Spanish-American War of 1805, Lee would have probably faded into continued obscurity and bankruptcy, and probably would have died very much a undistinguished and forgotten and infamous death. But this war rehabilitates his image, much like other generals throughout history. A fortunate war saves them from oblivion, and this would definitely be the case with Lee. And this war would produce a great many heroes, including Andrew Jackson, Sam Houston, Davy Crockett, Stephen Decatur, and Lewis and Clark themselves. I mean, the Clark's adventures in Oregon and California are the stuff that a Sir Walter Scott novel is made of. I mean, at one point he duels the Spanish commander of a Spanish fort with quarterstaffs. The commander challenged him to a duel to see who got control of the fort. We still don't know why he did it. It's such a stupid thing to do. He probably could have held that fort, but they were in the wilderness, and he figured, well, let's have single combat. And he figured they would fight with swords like European gentlemen and fence for it. But Clark, as the challenge party, chose basically two stout poles, 8-foot poles, and they went at it like Robin Hood and Little John on a bridge, and where Clark's much more sinewy frame and sheer muscle was able to overcome the more slight Spanish commander. And so this key fort on their way to California was overcome through this. And if you wrote this in a novel, no one would believe it. I mean, it's just amazing, the many heroes that were produced by this war. But subsequently to this, during the invasion of Texas, Burr has very little trouble at securing his overland expedition. It takes him a little while to get, of course, from the Sabine to the Rio Grande, but he is almost entirely supported by the local population, which is very small. You got to remember, Texas at that point was almost completely unpopulated. There were some Spanish missions, church Catholic missions, but very little population there other than the Indians. And his route didn't really take him along the the stomping grounds of the Comanche. And in fact, Burr, who always thought of everything and was a good planner, because he remembered having been on Benedict Arnold's expedition to Canada, how vital it was not to forget things like logistics, to make sure that you had allies and going to be ruined by logistics, and also the weather had to be with you as well. So he learned from the Arnold expedition to Canada, and that was very successful for him to be able to get through Texas in relatively short order. But here's where it really gets interesting. He crosses the Rio Grande, but you got to remember, northern Mexico has a lot of mountains, and winter is coming. And he has to make a decision. Does he wait till spring of 1806 to descend into Mexico, or does he take the much riskier option, which is to try to march overland through these mountains, through the snow of northern Mexico? Think about it as sort of a small version of the Rockies, or like the Appalachian Mountains, in winter, to try to surprise the Spanish, sort of Trenton and Princeton style.
Wait a second. A winter march through the mountains. I've heard that somewhere else in history.
Well, exactly. And as you probably can guess, Burr decides to take the more daring option, because he wants to conquer as much land as possible, as fast as possible, before the Spanish can get themselves organized, and also before Jefferson can relieve him of command, because he suspects Jefferson would like nothing better than to do so. So he assembles as many men, as many materials as he can, and marches over these mountains. And this expedition, this over the mountains in the middle of winter, will earn him the title the American Hannibal. And this is perhaps the most daring expedition of the entire war. And when he descends into northern Mexico, out of the mountains, he catches the Spanish completely off guard. They're already dealing with rebellions that the Catholic Church is instigating in the rural countryside among the peasants and the Creoles. They are already starting to have to put out these fires. And now Burr descends on northern Mexico. And this is one thing he also does. He captures several caches of arms and supplies, and arms the peasants, builds up the Mexican independent militia, and under his leadership, and has his professional officers there from the U.S. Army to train them. He has a small corps of regular American Army, plus adventurers and militia from Tennessee, from Louisiana, from Kentucky, from other Western territories of the United States. But he makes a key decision, which is to avoid pitched battles, because he does not have enough experienced troops to be able to match the Spanish in a stand-up fight. So he uses the tactics of Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox of the Revolution, Thomas Sumner. He goes back to what he did when he was fighting under Washington. He would organize raids on the British during the time of 1777, 1778, 1779. He would send expeditions, and he would personally lead them as a young officer. They would sneak up on a British picket line and, slice the throats of 2 or 3 British sentries, and then retreat back into the night. And then the next day, the British would see that, and they would double the guard, and the guard would get less sleep. And then they'd kill 2 more. Another British sentry would be found with a tomahawk through his heart the next night. And it just kept the British in a constant state of fear. And sometimes he would raid a place and take all their supplies as well, kill them all and take their supplies. So it's a less remembered chapter in history, how Burr waged this guerrilla, special operations type war. The first commandos, Burr and his men during the War of Independence, you could call them the first American commandos. He employs these tactics, these frontier tactics, stealth tactics in Mexico, a combination of insurgency by his Mexican militia and these attacks on these Mexican outposts. And what that does is it causes the Spanish government, the Spanish viceroy, to concentrate his forces in the major areas. So he pulls his forces into a few safe, strong points like Mexico City and Veracruz, which means that the countryside very quickly becomes a Burr's strong area. Without having to fight, he basically has conquered all of Mexico up to the Yucatan jungle, with the exception of a few strong points. And by June, he's able to, through a combination of stealth and brute force, capture Veracruz. And the capture of Veracruz on June 30th, when he marches into Veracruz, is basically the end of the Mexican campaign, because without getting resupplies via the key port of Veracruz, that's the last major port that the Spanish control. And without that, they can't maintain themselves in a hostile country. They can't go out for supplies without massive casualties. Think about the later Peninsular War, where the French in Spain were constantly being attacked and killed, and they had to send 200 men out at one time. If ever a courier was traveling from Paris to Madrid, they have to send 200 mounted escorts, a cavalry force of 200 men, just to get one rider through. And even then, they didn't always get through. So when Burr captured Veracruz, that was the end of Spanish control over Mexico. And as a result, the viceroy would subsequently ask for an armistice, which Burr agreed to. And just July 4th, Burr had a sense of history. On July 4th, 1806, representatives of the Catholic Church, the Spanish insurgency, and Burr being all present, the Mexican Declaration of Independence was signed in Veracruz just a few days after he marched into the city in triumph. And this is the beginning of what most historians call that second phase in Burr's life, the Mexican phase in Burr's life. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, and I'll stop talking now and let you give your say on that. Any comments you have, and also anything you think that we need to let the folks know about how far we've strayed from the original history.
Yeah, we strayed a far away, but we haven't, because as you and I talked about off podcast, a lot of the layout of this here, is similar to what will eventually be known as the Mexican-American War. In the real timeline, it's several decades ahead, but what you described there tactically, which is also strategic in terms of how the military campaign was exercised. I happen to live in that part of Texas that you're talking about. I'm in southeast Texas, so that I actually live less than 8 miles away from the battle site of San Jacinto, which is where Texas won its independence in the real timeline. But what you're talking about there, that sparsely populated area, eventually that in the real timeline, that's going to be Stephen F. Austin and other impresarios that are brought in by the Mexican government to try to hold these territories against the Indian influence. They bring in Anglo-American settlers who declare their loyalty, in this case, the Mexican government, primarily in the late 18-teens and early 1820s in the real timeline. But what you described there, I very much know this territory now because it's my backyard, and know the real timeline of Texas history. Moving through that territory quickly, as you described, would have been a very easy thing to do. And again, there was opportunity that existed to just do what was done later in the Spanish-American War under a different context much earlier. The other thing I'd just like to mention is that, in this alternative timeline, in your outline here of the soon-to-be, at some point in time, well-selling book that describes, by the way, the title of that book, by the way, the title of the episode is going to be American Hannibal. I think that may be a good title for the book. I'm just suggesting that. But is that we also find here this does continue along the same lines. Again, we still have the Louisiana Purchase, which happened in 1803. It happens here as well. And we still also have, we're talking about Wilkinson. I don't want to spend too much time talking about him, but this idea that he was, in fact, a traitor in the real timeline. It wasn't fully discovered and fully documented until, I guess, the 1850s. And in the real timeline, he was the governor of Louisiana. So he had a position of prominence. In your alternative timeline, you just changed his role slightly, that he's subordinate to Burr, who's now in that role. But the real Wilkinson of history was a spy. He was a traitor. And
he was.
And so the idea that if you find out about his role there, and then it's someone that's clever and as capable as Burr is able to then turn that and utilize that, that's not out of Burr's character, that's not out of Wilkinson's character, and it matches well with where things stood with what was going on globally because of the war, the coalitions formed against France and Spain, and what's going on there. I mean, this sounds very different, obviously, than the real timeline of history, but it's all based in plausible events if you understand the real timeline. And speaking of timeline, this is where we've chosen to put a break between part one and part two of this two-part exploration of an alternate history involving Aaron Burr following the election of 1800. I invite you to join us on the next episode, where we will continue the discussion with Brant and his proposed alternate timeline, and we'll see that there's a lot more in store for Mr. Burr. post-presidency, as he is now in the position of being the governor, Louisiana Major General in the Army, and we see where that takes him, and it'll take him to places that you might not even have imagined. So we invite you back next time on A Fork in Time to the conclusion of this particular episode. As we close out here, just remind you that if you want to learn more about the podcast, we certainly invite you to visit us at our website, which is www.aforkintimepodcast.com. There you can get all kinds of information about who we are and what we do, also the different ways that you can promote, support, and participate in the community that we're building here, looking at alternate history on A Fork in Time. So until next time, when we conclude with part 2 of this 2-part episode, we look forward to seeing you then. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Join us next time.